$75,000. That's what HOA Karen fined me for storing too much rainwater in my own backyard. I'm a retired water engineer who spent 40 years designing flood systems, and this real estate shark is telling me my perfectly legal rain collection makes the neighborhood look poor. She gave me 30 days to pay or lose my house. But Karen made one fatal mistake. She had no idea I knew exactly where all that water goes when it's not in my system. While she was busy forging fake violation notices and stealing homes from elderly neighbors, I was quietly calculating what would happen when the storm of the century hit our neighborhood. And let me tell you, karma flows downhill fast. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this flooding revenge is absolutely perfect. And if you believe no HOA Karen should ever get away with weaponizing fake fines against innocent homeowners, smash that subscribe button, because you don't want to miss what happens when Mother Nature delivers the ultimate receipt. I opened my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in October, expecting the usual junk mail and maybe my electric bill. Instead, I found a certified letter that made my blood pressure spike faster than a broken water main. The return address read, Willowbrook Homeowners Association, in fancy gold lettering, and the envelope felt thick enough to choke a horse. I figured it was probably another reminder about fall lawn maintenance or some nonsense about Halloween decorations, but when I tore it open, the words hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. Notice of violation and fine. $75,000. $75,000. For what? I had to read it 3 times before my brain could process the sheer stupidity of what they were claiming. According to this official-looking document, I was guilty of illegal rainwater storage exceeding community standards and violation of municipal water management codes, Section 47.3b. The letter claimed my rainwater collection system was an unsightly environmental hazard that violated both HOA covenants and city regulations. They gave me 30 days to pay the fine or face foreclosure proceedings on my home. Let me tell you something about myself. My name is Dave Martinez. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 40 years as a municipal water engineer before I retired. I designed drainage systems for 3 different counties and helped write half the water management codes they were supposedly citing. When my wife Elena passed away 3 years ago from cancer, I sold our family home and used my pension to buy this modest 3-bedroom house in Willowbrook. It wasn't the fanciest neighborhood, but it was quiet, safe, and had enough yard space for me to install a proper rainwater harvesting system. See, after 4 decades of watching cities waste billions of gallons of perfectly good water, I wanted to do my part for conservation. Plus, Elena always loved gardening, and I figured collecting rainwater for her memorial rose garden was a fitting tribute. The system I installed wasn't some backyard contraption made from garbage cans and garden hoses. I hired licensed contractors, pulled proper permits from the county, and built everything to professional standards. We're talking about food-grade polyethylene tanks, first flush diverters, automated overflow systems, and filtration that would make most municipal plants jealous. The whole setup could store about 3,000 gallons of rainwater, which I used exclusively for irrigation. During dry spells, my garden stayed green, while my neighbors watched their lawns turn brown. During heavy rains, my system prevented runoff that would otherwise flood the storm drains. It was a win-win situation that any competent water engineer would applaud. But apparently, the Willowbrook HOA saw things differently. As I stood there holding this ridiculous fine notice, my hands started shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. The letter was signed by Karen Westfield, HOA president, and it referenced municipal codes that either didn't exist or had nothing to do with residential rainwater collection. I know because I helped write some of those codes back in 1987. The whole thing was such obvious bullshit that I almost laughed, except for the part where they threatened to take my house. I marched straight to my computer and started pulling up the actual municipal water codes. Sure enough, not only was residential rainwater harvesting completely legal, but the county actively encouraged it with tax incentives and rebate programs. My system had been inspected and approved before installation, with all the paperwork filed correctly. I had copies of everything: the permits, the inspection reports, the contractor certifications, even the environmental impact assessment. This wasn't some gray area or questionable interpretation of the rules. The HOA was flat out wrong, and they were either incompetent or lying through their teeth. That's when I decided to call the HOA office and straighten this mess out like a reasonable adult. I figured there had to be some mistake, maybe a mix-up with another property or a misunderstanding about what my system actually did. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Willowbrook Homeowners Association, this is Karen Westfield speaking. I introduced myself politely and explained that I'd received what appeared to be an erroneous fine notice. There was a pause, then Karen's voice shifted to that condescending tone that instantly tells you someone thinks they're better than you. "Oh yes, Mr. Martinez," she said, drawing out my name like it tasted bad. "Your illegal water hoarding situation. I'm glad you called, because we need to discuss your options for bringing your property into compliance." Water hoarding? I spent the next 10 minutes explaining the legal framework for residential rainwater collection, citing specific code sections and permit numbers. Karen interrupted me repeatedly, insisting that community standards superseded individual property rights, and that my system was negatively impacting neighborhood aesthetics. When I asked her to show me exactly which municipal codes I was violating, she got snippy and said the HOA had conducted extensive research and consulted with municipal authorities. I asked which authorities specifically, and she gave me some runaround about confidential consultations and proprietary legal analysis. Finally, I asked the obvious question: did she have any actual training or education in water management? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Karen cleared her throat and said in a voice colder than January rain, "Mr. Martinez, you have 30 days to pay this fine and remove your illegal storage system, or we will proceed with foreclosure. The decision is final." Click. She hung up on me. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling like I'd just been sucker punched by a stranger. This wasn't about water codes or community standards. This was about some power-hungry HOA president trying to flex her authority, and she'd picked the wrong target. After 40 years of dealing with bureaucratic bullies, politicians, and developers who thought they could bulldoze over technical expertise with loud voices and empty threats, I recognized the type. Karen Westfield had no idea who she was messing with, but she was about to get a very expensive education in water engineering and the consequences of forging municipal citations. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center, and I figured this was my chance to clear everything up like a civilized adult. I spent 3 days preparing a simple presentation with photos of my system, copies of the county permits, and printouts of the actual municipal codes that proved rainwater collection was not only legal but encouraged. I even brought laminated fact sheets for the board members, thinking that once they saw the real evidence, this whole mess would disappear faster than water down a storm drain. Boy, was I wrong about that. The community center meeting room smelled like stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. About 20 residents showed up, most of them looking bored or checking their phones. I recognized a few neighbors, but didn't know anyone well enough to chat. Right at 7, Karen Westfield swept into the room like she owned the place, which I guess she kind of did. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair, and one of those blazers that screams, "I sell real estate and I'm very important." She carried a thick binder and spoke in the kind of loud, fake cheerful voice that immediately puts you on edge. "Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Willowbrook HOA board meeting," Karen announced, settling into the head chair like a queen taking her throne. The 4 other board members filed in behind her, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen launched into the usual routine. reading last month's minutes, discussing the annual holiday decoration guidelines, arguing about pool maintenance schedules. I sat there patiently, waiting for my chance to speak during the open comment period. When Karen finally called for resident concerns, I stood up and introduced myself politely. Good evening. I'm Dave Martinez from Maple Street, and I'd like to address the violation notice I received regarding my rainwater collection system. I started explaining the legal framework, showing my permits and county approvals. Karen let me talk for maybe 30 seconds before she cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand. Mr. Martinez, we've already discussed your situation extensively, and the board's decision is final, she said, not even looking at the documents I'd brought. Your illegal water hoarding system violates multiple community standards and creates an unsightly blight on our neighborhood. Water hoarding. There was that phrase again. I tried to stay calm and asked Karen to specify which community standards I was violating. She opened her binder and started reading from what sounded like official municipal code, citing section numbers and regulatory language about excessive residential water storage and aesthetic compliance requirements. But here's the thing about spending 40 years in municipal engineering. You develop an ear for bureaucratic bullshit. And what Karen was reading sounded wrong. The section numbers didn't match any code I knew, and the language was too vague to be real regulatory text. Excuse me, I interrupted, but could you tell me which municipal authority provided those code citations? Because I've reviewed the actual county water management regulations, and they don't match what you're reading. Karen's face flushed red, and her voice got sharp. Mr. Martinez, I don't appreciate your tone or your implication that this board hasn't done its homework. We've consulted extensively with city officials and legal experts. I asked again which specific officials, and Karen slammed her binder shut. That information is confidential due to ongoing legal consultations. That's when things got really ugly. Karen stood up and addressed the room like she was giving a campaign speech. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that threatens our property values and community standards. Mr. Martinez thinks his personal water hoarding project is more important than the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood. He's turning Willowbrook into some kind of survivalist compound, with his industrial storage tanks and pipes running all over his yard. Half the room was nodding along, and I realized with growing horror that these people had no idea what they were agreeing with. I pulled out my phone and started recording, which immediately got Karen's attention. Mr. Martinez, recording is not permitted during board meetings without prior authorization, she snapped. I kept the phone rolling and asked to see that rule in the HOA bylaws. Karen consulted with another board member for about 30 seconds, then announced that recording was a violation of privacy policies and community meeting protocols. When I asked to see those policies in writing, she got even madder. Sir, your continued disruption of this meeting is creating a hostile environment for other residents. If you can't conduct yourself appropriately, you'll need to leave. The whole room was staring at me now, and I could feel the social pressure building. These weren't bad people, just folks who wanted quiet lives without conflict. But they were letting Karen steamroll right over basic fairness and legal procedure because it was easier than asking difficult questions. I tried one more time to explain the facts. My system was legal, permitted, and beneficial to the neighborhood's drainage. Karen cut me off again. Mr. Martinez, your illegal modifications make this neighborhood look poor and desperate. No respectable community allows residents to collect rainwater like some third-world shantytown. That comment hit me like a slap in the face. My wife Elena grew up in Mexico, and we'd visited her family many times. I'd seen real water scarcity, and communities that would kill for the kind of conservation technology I'd installed. Karen's casual racism was bad enough, but the ignorance behind it was even worse. This woman had no clue about water engineering, environmental science, or basic human decency, yet she was wielding HOA authority like a weapon. I stood up to leave, but Karen wasn't done with me yet. Before you go, Mr. Martinez, I want everyone here to understand the full scope of this situation. Your behavior tonight demonstrates exactly why we can't allow rule breakers to disrupt community harmony. Effective immediately, I'm filing additional violations against your property for creating a public disturbance and refusing to comply with board directives. That's another $15,000 in fines, due within 30 days. The room went dead silent. Even the other board members looked uncomfortable. I walked out without saying another word, but I kept that phone recording every step of the way. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking with rage. This wasn't about water codes or community standards. This was about a petty tyrant using manufactured authority to bully anyone who dared question her power. Karen Westfield had just declared war on me in front of 20 witnesses, and she'd made it personal with that racist garbage about third-world shantytowns. What she didn't realize was that 40 years of municipal engineering had taught me more than just water management. I'd learned how to fight bureaucratic bullies, and I was about to give her a master class in the consequences of forging official documents and abusing HOA power. The morning after that disaster of a board meeting, I did what any reasonable engineer does when faced with bogus technical claims. I went straight to the source. I spent 3 hours on the county website, downloading every water management regulation, zoning code, and environmental guideline I could find. Then I cross-referenced the section numbers Karen had cited during her little performance. Want to guess what I discovered? Half of those code sections didn't exist, and the other half had nothing to do with residential water storage. Section 47.3b, which was prominently featured in my original fine notice, was actually about commercial septic tank maintenance. Karen had either made up these citations completely or grabbed random numbers from unrelated regulations, hoping nobody would fact-check her work. But I wasn't satisfied with just proving Karen wrong on paper. I needed official confirmation from someone with real authority. So I called my former colleague, Maria Santos, at the County Water Department. Maria and I had worked together for 15 years before I retired, and she was now the senior water management engineer for the whole district. When I explained my situation, Maria's reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for: professional outrage mixed with technical curiosity. "Dave, that's completely insane," she said. "Residential rainwater harvesting isn't just legal, it's actively encouraged. We give people tax breaks for installing systems like yours. Can you email me copies of these violation notices?" 20 minutes later, Maria called me back, and her voice had shifted from curious to furious. "Dave, I've reviewed everything you sent, and this HOA is either criminally incompetent or deliberately fraudulent. None of these code citations are real. The section numbers are fabricated. The regulatory language is nonsense, and the municipal authority they claim to represent doesn't exist. This isn't a misunderstanding or a gray area interpretation. This is fraud." She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I'm looking at your original permit application right now. Your system was approved unanimously by the Planning Commission, passed all inspections with flying colors, and actually exceeds current environmental standards. You're not violating anything. You're a model citizen." Maria offered to write an official letter confirming the legal status of my system, complete with county letterhead and her professional seal. While she worked on that, I decided to do some detective work on Karen Westfield herself. A quick internet search revealed that Karen was indeed a licensed real estate agent with Westfield Properties, a small firm that specialized in luxury residential transactions in upscale neighborhoods. Her company website featured the usual glamour shots and testimonials. But what caught my attention was a recent blog post titled "Maximizing Property Values Through Strategic Community Management." The post discussed how HOA enforcement could be used to encourage voluntary property transfers and optimize neighborhood demographics for premium market positioning. That blog post made my blood run cold. Karen wasn't just some power-hungry busybody throwing her weight around for kicks. She was using HOA authority as a business strategy, targeting residents she considered undesirable and pressuring them to sell their homes. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I was a perfect target. Elderly, recently widowed, living alone in a house that could probably fetch a decent price if flipped by the right real estate agent. Karen's whole rainwater violation scheme was just a sophisticated shakedown designed to force me out of the neighborhood. I called Maria back and shared my theory about Karen's real motivations. Maria listened quietly, then dropped a bombshell that made everything click into place. Dave, I hate to tell you this, but your situation might be even worse than you think. Last month, I reviewed some drainage modification permits for properties in your neighborhood, and the applicant was Westfield Properties. Karen has been making significant changes to the natural water flow patterns around there. If I remember correctly, she diverted a major drainage channel that runs right through the area where your house is located. Maria agreed to meet me the next afternoon to review the neighborhood's original drainage survey maps. We met at a coffee shop near the county offices, and Maria brought a thick folder full of engineering drawings and permit applications. The original 1987 drainage survey showed Willowbrook's natural water flow patterns, with a major seasonal creek running through what was now Karen Street before connecting to the main storm water system. According to the survey, my property sat at a slightly elevated position that naturally collected runoff from the surrounding area during heavy rains. "Look at this, Dave," Maria said, pointing to a red line on the most recent drainage modification permit. Karen filed this application 6 months ago to redirect the seasonal creek flow around her property. She claimed it was necessary to prevent basement flooding in her house, but look at where that redirected water is supposed to go. She traced the new flow pattern with her finger, and my stomach dropped. The modified drainage sent all that redirected water straight toward the lower-lying properties on my street, including my house. "So let me get this straight," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen illegally modified the neighborhood's natural drainage to protect her own property, and now she's fining me for collecting the extra runoff water that her modifications are sending my way? Maria nodded grimly. It gets worse. According to county flood management regulations, any residential modifications that alter natural drainage patterns require environmental impact studies and community notification. Karen's permit application doesn't include either of those requirements, which means her drainage changes are probably illegal. Maria pulled out another document that made my engineer's heart sing with vindicated rage. It was the official county inspection report for my rainwater collection system, dated just 2 weeks after installation. The inspector had specifically noted that my system would help mitigate seasonal flooding in the area by capturing runoff that would otherwise overwhelm the storm drains during heavy rain events. In other words, my perfectly legal water collection system was actually protecting the neighborhood from the flooding problems that Karen's illegal drainage modifications had created. "Dave, I need to ask you something important," Maria said, lowering her voice. "Have you noticed any changes in water flow patterns around your property during the last few heavy rains? Any flooding or drainage issues that weren't there before?" I thought back to the spring storm season and remembered something that hadn't seemed significant at the time. During the big April storm, I'd noticed water pooling in areas of my yard that had always drained perfectly before. I'd assumed it was just an unusually heavy rainfall, but now I realized it was probably the result of Karen's drainage modifications sending extra water my way. Maria gathered up her papers and gave me a look that was part sympathy and part professional excitement. "Dave, I think we've got enough evidence to file a formal complaint with the County Development Office. Karen's drainage modifications appear to violate multiple environmental regulations. Her HOA citations are completely fraudulent, and your rainwater system is not only legal, but beneficial to neighborhood flood control. This is the kind of case that makes county attorneys very interested in pursuing criminal fraud charges." She paused and smiled for the first time all afternoon. "But before we go nuclear with the legal system, I want to take another look at those original neighborhood drainage plans. Something tells me Karen's little water redirection project is about to create some very expensive problems for her, especially with storm season coming up. Over the next 3 days, I started connecting dots that painted a picture uglier than a burst sewage line. Armed with Maria's official letter confirming my system was completely legal, I decided to do some neighborhood reconnaissance. What I discovered made Karen's rainwater scam look like small-time fraud compared to the real operation she was running. During my morning walks, I started paying attention to which houses had violation notices taped to their doors or warning signs posted in their yards. The pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. Karen was systematically targeting elderly residents, single homeowners, and anyone who looked like they might be vulnerable to legal intimidation. My first stop was 3 houses down from mine, where I'd noticed a bright orange violation sticker on the front door. The house belonged to Joe Chen, a retired electrician who'd always kept his property immaculate. I knocked on his door and introduced myself, explaining that I was dealing with some HOA issues and wondered if he was having similar problems. Joe's face darkened the moment I mentioned Karen's name. "That woman is trying to steal my house," he said, inviting me inside. "She's claiming my electrical panel violates neighborhood safety standards and demanding I pay $12,000 to have it replaced by her preferred contractor." Joe showed me his violation notice, and my blood started boiling all over again. The document looked official as hell, complete with fake municipal letterhead and citations to non-existent electrical codes. But here's the kicker. Joe had just had his entire electrical system upgraded 6 months ago by a licensed contractor, with all the proper permits and inspections. The work exceeded current building codes by a wide margin. Karen was essentially fining him for having electrical work that was too safe and up to date. She told me if I don't pay, she'll report me to the city for having an illegal electrical hazard. Joe said, "I'm 73 years old, Dave. I can't afford lawyers, and I can't afford to lose this house." That afternoon, Joe and I walked around the neighborhood together, and we discovered 2 more victims. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow on Oak Street, had received a $15,000 fine for improper landscape maintenance, creating pest habitat conditions. Her crime? Having a small vegetable garden that Karen claimed violated aesthetic standards and attracted rodents. The violation notice cited made-up health department regulations and threatened county intervention for unsanitary agricultural activities in residential zones. Mrs. Patterson was so scared, she'd already started pulling up her tomato plants. The 4th victim was probably the most heartbreaking. Tom Rodriguez lived alone in a tidy ranch house after his wife moved to assisted living with dementia. Karen had hit him with an $18,000 fine for structural modifications without proper permits, claiming his wheelchair ramp violated building codes and neighborhood appearance standards. The ramp had been installed by a licensed contractor with full county permits after Tom's knee replacement surgery. Karen's fake violation notice demanded immediate removal of the ramp and restoration of the original front steps, which would essentially trap Tom in his own house. As Joe and I compared violation notices, the real scope of Karen's fraud became crystal clear. All 4 of us had received official-looking documents with fake municipal codes, non-existent regulatory authorities, and impossible compliance deadlines. The fines ranged from $12,000 to $75,000, and all of them targeted improvements or features that were perfectly legal and properly permitted. But here's what really got my attention. Every single one of us lived in houses that would be attractive to real estate flippers in a neighborhood where property values were climbing fast. I spent that evening researching Karen's real estate business, and what I found made me sick to my stomach. Westfield Properties had purchased 6 homes in our neighborhood over the past 2 years, all of them bought at below-market prices from elderly sellers who were motivated to relocate quickly due to family circumstances. The company's website featured before and after photos of their renovation projects, showing modest family homes transformed into upscale showpieces with granite countertops and hardwood floors. They were flipping these houses for profits of $60,000 to $80,000 each. The pattern was so obvious it should have been criminal. Target vulnerable homeowners with fake HOA violations, pressure them with impossible fines and legal threats, then swoop in as the helpful real estate agent, offering to help them relocate to a more suitable community. It was a sophisticated con game, using HOA authority as the weapon and manufactured fear as the ammunition. Karen had turned neighborhood governance into a personal profit center, and she'd probably been getting away with it for years because her targets were exactly the kind of people who don't fight back against official-looking paperwork. That night, Joe came over to my house, and we called Mrs. Patterson and Tom Rodriguez. I explained what I'd discovered about Karen's fake citations and her real estate scam. Mrs. Patterson started crying with relief when I told her that her vegetable garden was completely legal and that no health department had ever issued regulations about residential tomatoes. Tom got angry, which was exactly the reaction I was hoping for. "So this witch is trying to steal our houses?" he said. "What do we do about it?" I had been thinking about that question all day. The four of us had solid evidence of Karen's fraud. Fake municipal codes, forged regulatory citations, and a clear pattern of targeting elderly homeowners for financial gain. We had official documentation proving our homes were in full legal compliance. We had Maria's professional expertise and county authority backing us up. What we needed now was a coordinated strategy to expose Karen's scam before she could foreclose on any of our properties or pressure anyone else into selling. "Here's what I think we should do," I told them. "We document everything. We coordinate our responses, and we show up to the next HOA board meeting as a united front." Karen's been getting away with this because she picks on people one at a time, making each of us feel isolated and helpless. But there are four of us now, and we've got the evidence to prove she's running a criminal enterprise disguised as HOA enforcement. Joe nodded enthusiastically, and even Mrs. Patterson seemed to be getting some of her fighting spirit back. But as we were planning our strategy, I got a phone call that changed everything. It was Maria, and her voice was tight with professional concern. "Dave, I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. I've been reviewing Karen's drainage modification permits more carefully, and there's something else you need to know. Those changes she made to the neighborhood water flow, they're not just illegal, they're dangerous. With the storm system that's heading our way next week, her modifications could cause serious flooding problems for the entire area." She paused, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "But here's the thing that really concerns me, Dave. I just got word that Karen has filed foreclosure paperwork against all four of your properties. You've got 72 hours before those proceedings become official." I met Maria at the county offices at 8 o'clock sharp the next morning, and she had spread out what looked like half the engineering department's archives across a conference table. The original 1987 neighborhood drainage survey was a thing of beauty, showing Willowbrook's natural water flow patterns in precise detail. But when Maria overlaid Karen's recent modification permits on top of the original survey, the result looked like a disaster waiting to happen. "Dave, look at this," she said, pointing to a series of red lines that showed Karen's drainage changes. She's essentially created a funnel that redirects seasonal creek flow from 3 different directions toward the lowest-lying properties in the neighborhood. During normal rainfall, it probably won't matter much. But if you get a major storm event, this is going to create serious flooding problems. The engineering math was pretty straightforward once you understood what Karen had done. The original drainage system had been designed to handle water flow from a 50-year storm event, which means rainfall severe enough to happen roughly once every 50 years. Karen's modifications had concentrated that same water volume into a much smaller drainage area, effectively overwhelming the system's capacity during any significant rainfall. But here's the part that made my engineer's brain light up like a Christmas tree. My rainwater collection system was positioned perfectly to intercept the redirected water flow before it could cause downstream flooding. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, studying the overlaid maps. Karen illegally modified the neighborhood drainage to protect her own property, but in doing so, she created a flooding risk for everyone else. My rainwater collection system, which she's trying to force me to remove, is actually the only thing preventing her illegal modifications from causing a major flood disaster. Maria nodded grimly. That's exactly right. And according to the Weather Service, there's a major storm system developing in the Gulf that could bring 3 to 5 inches of rainfall to this area within the next week. Maria pulled out another document that made everything click into place. It was the county's flood hazard assessment for the Willowbrook area, updated just 6 months ago. The assessment specifically mentioned that residential rainwater collection systems could help mitigate flood risks in areas where natural drainage had been compromised by development. In other words, the county was actively encouraging residents to do exactly what I had done, especially in neighborhoods like ours, where drainage modifications had created potential flood hazards. Here's what we're going to do, Maria said, gathering up the engineering drawings. I'm filing an emergency engineering report with the County Development Office today. This report will document Karen's illegal drainage modifications, confirm that your rainwater system is not only legal but beneficial for flood control, and recommend immediate suspension of all HOA enforcement actions pending a full investigation. She paused and gave me a look that was part professional excitement and part righteous anger. But Dave, there's something else you need to know. I pulled the records for Karen's real estate transactions in your neighborhood, and the timing is very suspicious. She bought 3 of those 6 properties within 30 days of filing HOA violations against the previous owners. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting with Joe, Mrs. Patterson, and Tom Rodriguez. We gathered in my living room, and I spread out copies of all the evidence Maria and I had compiled. The engineering drawings, the fake violation notices, the real estate transaction records, and Maria's official letters created a picture so damning that even Tom's usually calm demeanor cracked. So this woman has been systematically defrauding elderly homeowners and using fake HOA violations to steal their houses at below market prices, he said. And now she's trying to create a flood disaster by forcing you to remove the only thing protecting the neighborhood from her illegal drainage modifications. Mrs. Patterson, who had seemed fragile and scared just days before, surprised us all by slamming her hand on the coffee table. That's it. I've had enough of this nonsense. My husband fought in Vietnam, and I raised 3 kids while working 2 jobs to pay for this house. Some real estate shark is not going to scare me out of my home with fake paperwork and made-up regulations. Joe and Tom nodded enthusiastically, and I realized we had transformed from individual victims into a coordinated resistance movement. The plan we developed was beautifully simple. Instead of waiting for the next regular HOA meeting, we would demand an emergency board session within 48 hours to address what we would call urgent safety concerns regarding illegal drainage modifications and fraudulent enforcement actions. We had Maria's engineering report, copies of all the fake violation notices, evidence of Karen's real estate transactions, and documentation proving that all our properties were in full legal compliance. Most importantly, we had the weather forecast showing a major storm approaching within days. I spent that evening preparing our presentation, organizing the evidence into a clear timeline that even the most conflict-averse board member couldn't ignore. The story we would tell was simple. Karen Westfield had been using fabricated HOA violations to pressure elderly residents into selling their homes at below-market prices to her real estate company. She had illegally modified the neighborhood's drainage system to benefit her own property while creating flood risks for everyone else. And now she was trying to force the removal of the only system that could prevent disaster when the approaching storm hit. But as I was putting the finishing touches on our presentation, the phone rang. It was Joe, and his voice was tight with anger. "Dave, you need to come over here right now. Karen just served me with foreclosure papers, and there's something else. She's got people measuring my property and taking photos like they're already planning renovations. I grabbed my jacket and headed for Joe's house. But before I could get out the door, my own doorbell rang. Standing on my front porch was a process server, with an envelope thick enough to choke a horse. The foreclosure papers were professionally printed and looked official as hell, complete with legal case numbers and court filing stamps. According to the documents, Willowbrook HOA was seeking immediate seizure of my property due to ongoing violations of community standards and failure to pay assessed fines totaling $90,000. The papers gave me exactly 48 hours to either pay the full amount or appear in court to contest the foreclosure action. As I read through the legal language, one thing became crystal clear. Karen had accelerated her timeline because she knew we were building a case against her. I called Maria immediately, and her reaction was exactly what I needed to hear. Dave, this is actually good news. Karen just made a major tactical mistake by rushing into foreclosure proceedings before the county investigation is complete. Tomorrow morning, I'm hand-delivering my emergency engineering report to the county attorney's office, the Development Oversight Committee, and the district judge handling HOA disputes. Karen's about to discover that filing fraudulent legal documents carries much more serious penalties than she bargained for. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. But Dave, there's something else you need to consider. That storm system is intensifying faster than originally predicted. The Weather Service just upgraded their rainfall forecast to 6 to 8 inches over a 2-day period. If Karen succeeds in forcing you to remove your rainwater collection system before that storm hits, the flooding damage could be catastrophic. The next morning felt like Christmas and Judgment Day rolled into one. Maria called me at 7 o'clock with news that made my heart race. The county inspector was coming to Willowbrook at 10 a.m. to conduct an emergency site evaluation based on her engineering report. Dave, this is it, she said. Inspector Rodriguez is one of the most thorough guys in the department, and he's got full authority to issue immediate cease and desist orders for any violations he finds. If Karen's drainage modifications are as illegal as we think they are, her whole operation is about to come crashing down. I spent the morning walking through my property with Inspector Rodriguez, showing him every component of my rainwater collection system while he took detailed measurements and photographs. Rodriguez was a soft-spoken professional who asked precise technical questions and took extensive notes on everything from my storage tank capacity to the overflow routing. When I showed him the county permits and inspection records from my original installation, he nodded approvingly. Mr. Martinez, this is exactly the kind of residential water conservation system we like to see. Everything is properly permitted, professionally installed, and exceeds current environmental standards. But the real fireworks started when we walked over to examine Karen's drainage modifications. Rodriguez pulled out the original 1987 survey maps and started comparing them to the current property layout, and his expression grew increasingly serious with each measurement he took. Karen had illegally diverted a seasonal creek that was supposed to flow through a natural easement behind her property, redirecting the water toward a new drainage channel that dumped directly onto the street where Joe, Mrs. Patterson, Tom, and I lived. The modifications violated at least 6 different county ordinances related to flood management, environmental protection, and water rights. This is a serious violation of municipal drainage codes, Rodriguez said, photographing the illegal channel modifications. These changes were made without proper permits, environmental impact studies, or community notification. More importantly, they've created a significant flood hazard for downstream properties. He pulled out his phone and made a call to someone at the county attorney's office, speaking in rapid Spanish for about 5 minutes. When he hung up, he looked directly at me with the kind of expression that tells you justice is about to be served. Mr. Martinez, I'm issuing an immediate cease and desist order for all HOA enforcement actions related to your property. Based on my inspection, your rainwater collection system is not only legal, but essential for neighborhood flood protection. That afternoon, the county called an emergency hearing for all parties involved in what they were now calling the Willowbrook drainage dispute. Karen showed up with a lawyer who looked like he charged $500 an hour. But she seemed nervous for the first time since I'd met her. The hearing was held in a small conference room at the county offices, with Inspector Rodriguez presenting his findings to a panel that included the county attorney, the development oversight administrator, and a representative from the Environmental Protection Division. Inspector Rodriguez's presentation was devastating. He had documented evidence of Karen's illegal drainage modifications, photographs showing the environmental damage caused by redirecting natural water flow, and engineering calculations, proving that my rainwater system was preventing flood damage that could affect dozens of homes. When Karen's lawyer tried to argue that HOA covenants gave them authority over residential water storage, Rodriguez calmly presented copies of the state regulations that explicitly protected homeowner rights to legal water conservation systems. The county attorney asked Karen directly about the municipal code citations in her violation notices, and watching her try to explain those fabricated regulations was like watching someone dig their own grave with a teaspoon. She stammered through some nonsense about consulting with municipal authorities and proprietary legal research. But when the attorney asked her to identify which specific authorities she had consulted, Karen's lawyer actually put his hand on her arm to stop her from talking. That's when you know someone is in deep legal trouble. The hearing concluded with the county issuing an official ruling that made my engineer's heart sing with vindicated joy. All HOA enforcement actions against my property were immediately suspended pending a full investigation into fraudulent citation practices. Karen was ordered to restore the original drainage patterns within 60 days, or face criminal charges for environmental violations. My rainwater collection system was officially recognized as a beneficial flood control measure that should remain in operation for public safety reasons. And here's the kicker. The county recommended that the district attorney investigate possible criminal fraud charges related to the fake municipal code citations in Karen's violation notices. But just as I was starting to feel like we'd won this battle, Karen's lawyer played what he must have thought was his trump card. He stood up and announced that regardless of the county's findings, the HOA board had voted to require removal of my water storage system under aesthetic compliance guidelines that didn't require municipal code citations. According to him, the HOA covenant granted them broad authority over neighborhood appearance standards, and my storage tanks created an unsightly industrial appearance that violated community aesthetic requirements. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even after being exposed for fraud, environmental violations, and illegal foreclosure attempts, Karen was still trying to force me to remove my rainwater system using a completely different legal argument. The county attorney looked as disgusted as I felt, but he had to explain that aesthetic compliance was generally considered an internal HOA matter unless it conflicted with municipal safety requirements. That's when Inspector Rodriguez dropped his own bombshell. He pulled out the latest Weather Service forecast and announced that the approaching storm system had been upgraded to a potential 100-year flood event with predicted rainfall totals of 8 to 12 inches over 3 days. Given the current drainage modifications and the approaching severe weather, removing Mr. Martinez's water collection system at this time would create an immediate public safety hazard. He said, "I'm recommending that the county issue an emergency protective order requiring the system to remain in operation until after the storm passes and permanent drainage repairs can be completed." The room went dead silent as everyone processed what Rodriguez had just said. Karen's face went pale, and her lawyer started frantically scribbling notes. But before anyone could respond, Karen made the mistake that sealed her fate. She stood up and declared in that same condescending tone I'd heard at the board meeting, "I don't care what some county bureaucrat thinks about aesthetics. That ugly water storage system is coming down, and if it causes flooding problems, That's not the HOA's responsibility. The county attorney leaned forward, with the expression of a prosecutor who just heard a confession. Ma'am, are you stating for the record that you intend to proceed with forced removal of a flood control system during a declared weather emergency, despite official county recommendations for public safety? Karen's lawyer grabbed her arm and whispered urgently in her ear. But the damage was already done. She had just admitted in front of multiple county officials that she was willing to endanger public safety to enforce her personal aesthetic preferences. The hearing ended with the county attorney announcing that the district attorney's office would be reviewing all aspects of this case for potential criminal charges, and that my rainwater system was now under official county protection as essential flood control infrastructure. As we walked out of the hearing, I felt like we'd finally won a decisive victory. But then Maria pulled me aside with a weather update that made my blood run cold. Dave, the storm system is moving faster than predicted. We're now looking at the first heavy rain starting tomorrow night, with peak intensity hitting in less than 48 hours. If Karen somehow finds a way to force removal of your system before then, the flooding damage could be catastrophic. What happened next still makes me sick to my stomach when I think about it. Despite everything we'd proven at the county hearing, despite Inspector Rodriguez's official findings, and despite the approaching storm that could bring catastrophic flooding, the HOA board caved to Karen's pressure in the most cowardly way possible. I got the call from Joe Chen at 6 o'clock that evening, and his voice was shaking with rage. "Dave, they did it!" The board held an emergency meeting without notifying us, and they voted 4-1 to support Karen's aesthetic compliance demand. You've got 48 hours to disconnect your rainwater system, or they're authorizing her to have it physically removed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These people had sat through presentations showing that Karen had committed fraud, violated environmental regulations, and endangered public safety, yet they were still giving her the authority to force removal of the neighborhood's only flood protection system. When I called the one board member who had voted against Karen's demand, he explained the twisted logic that had sealed their decision. "Dave, I'm sorry, but the other board members are terrified of liability." Karen's lawyer convinced them that if they don't enforce the aesthetic guidelines consistently, the HOA could face discrimination lawsuits from other residents who've been forced to modify their properties. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I called the county attorney's office, but they explained that aesthetic compliance was considered an internal HOA matter that couldn't be overruled unless it directly conflicted with emergency safety orders. I called my own lawyer, but he told me that fighting an HOA aesthetic ruling would take months of litigation that wouldn't be resolved before the storm hit. Even Maria, with all her county authority, couldn't find a legal mechanism to prevent the HOA from ordering disconnection of my system, as long as they weren't physically damaging county-protected infrastructure. So I faced the most difficult decision of this entire nightmare. Do I fight the HOA ruling and risk criminal trespass charges when Karen's contractors showed up to disconnect my system? Or do I comply with their demand and pray that the flooding wouldn't be as catastrophic as the engineering calculations predicted? After 4 decades of municipal engineering, I knew exactly what would happen when that storm hit, and my 3,000-gallon collection capacity was no longer available to intercept Karen's illegally redirected water flow. But I also knew that getting arrested for defending my property wouldn't help anyone when the floodwaters started rising. I spent that night disconnecting my beautiful rainwater collection system piece by piece, feeling like I was dismantling Elena's memory, along with the flood protection that could save my neighbors' homes. The storage tanks that had provided water for her memorial rose garden were drained and sealed. The filtration system that had kept our lawn green during the summer drought was shut down and bypassed. The overflow channels that would have safely routed excess stormwater to the municipal drainage system were blocked and redirected back to the natural flow pattern that would send everything straight toward Karen's illegal channel. Modifications. By dawn on Friday morning, my property looked exactly like Karen wanted it to. No visible storage tanks, No collection pipes, no evidence of the water conservation system that had taken me months to design and install. I stood in my backyard feeling defeated and hollow, watching the Weather Service radar show the massive storm system approaching from the Gulf of Mexico. The forecast had been upgraded again overnight. 12 to 15 inches of rainfall expected over the next 72 hours, with the heaviest precipitation occurring during a 6-hour period on Saturday night. The first raindrops started falling around noon on Friday. Just light drizzle that wouldn't have caused problems under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Without my collection system intercepting the flow, every drop of rain that fell on my roof and yard was flowing directly into the street drainage system that was already compromised by Karen's illegal modifications. I watched from my living room window as water began pooling in areas that had always drained perfectly before my system was disconnected. By Friday evening, the rain had intensified to a steady, moderate shower, and the water accumulation was becoming more noticeable. Joe called me around 8 o'clock to report that his street was already showing signs of drainage backup, with water flowing in directions that didn't match the original neighborhood topography. Mrs. Patterson called an hour later, worried about water pooling in her driveway for the first time in the 20 years she'd lived there. Tom Rodriguez reported that the storm drains on his street were struggling to handle the increased flow volume, making gurgling noises that suggested they were operating near capacity. Saturday morning brought the kind of steady, soaking rain that water engineers know is more dangerous than dramatic downpours. This was the type of rainfall that saturates soil, overwhelms drainage systems gradually, and creates the perfect conditions for widespread flooding when the really heavy precipitation arrives. I spent the day monitoring weather radar and making engineering calculations that confirmed my worst fears. When the peak storm intensity hit that night, Karen's illegally modified drainage system was going to funnel an enormous volume of water directly toward the lowest-lying properties in the neighborhood. The rain intensified dramatically around 6 o'clock Saturday evening, transforming from steady showers into the kind of deluge that makes you understand why ancient civilizations worshipped storm gods. I stood at my front window watching water pour off my roof and flow directly into the street, knowing that every gallon should have been captured by my disconnected storage system. The engineering calculations were playing out in real time. Without my 3,000-gallon collection capacity, the peak storm flow was going to exceed the drainage system's design limits by approximately 30%. Around 10 o'clock that night, the storm reached its predicted intensity, and Mother Nature began delivering her verdict on Karen's illegal drainage modifications. The rain was falling so hard that I could barely see across the street, but I could hear the roar of water flowing through Karen's redirected channel with a volume and velocity that should have been impossible in a residential neighborhood. Then Joe called with the news I'd been dreading. "Dave, the water is rising fast down here. Karen's street is starting to flood, and it's getting worse by the minute." I grabbed my rain gear and flashlight, knowing that I needed to document what was about to happen. As I stepped outside into the storm, I could see water flowing down the street like a river, following exactly the path that my engineering calculations had predicted. Karen's illegal drainage modifications had created a perfect funnel that was concentrating stormwater from multiple directions and sending it toward her own street with the force of a flash flood. The supreme irony of the situation hit me like lightning. Karen had destroyed the neighborhood's natural flood protection, forced me to disconnect the artificial flood protection, and now she was about to discover that water always finds its way downhill, especially when you've spent months redirecting it toward your own front door.